Can you help explain why ending NATO would be a good thing? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they're like, well, NATO, it's an alliance. These are our allies. It's normal for countries
Yeah,
to have an alliance, and it's good for
right.
us. It shows that we're united and we're strong and we're together.
Uh-huh.
Why should NATO
Right.
be ended?
It did serve a purpose during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was clearly an adversary, an ideological adversary, and a very powerful one that had a conventional army that could, very easily overrun Europe. And I don't think there was ever any great risk of that. But there was that potential, there was that capability, right? And so it was a true defensive alliance. It did not, it was when there were, for example, there was unrest within Warsaw Pact countries, such as in Hungary in the 1950s or Czechoslovakia in the 1960s. NATO and the West in general did not become involved. The Russians went in and put down those rebellions, and that was that. It was truly a defensive alliance, but it is no longer a defensive alliance. It's been expanding. It's it in Serbia. It shows sides in a civil conflict, and it attacked Serbia. The Serbian government peeled off a territory that's Kosovo. Very much an offensive operation. It engaged in offensive operations in a regime change operation in Libya. Again, this was not defensive. It was used for regime change, with really disastrous consequences in Libya. So, yeah, and then the raison d'être, the reason for its existence is no longer there. There is not a Soviet Union. Russia has neither the intent nor the capability to actually threaten Europe. I mean, it has, again, you get all this rhetoric, after Ukraine, it's going to be, Poland, and then they're going to take over, they'll be in the streets of London, in a couple of years. And it's just total nonsense. They don't have that capability. They don't have that interest. Ukraine is a unique case. They pretend to be surprised by it, like this was completely unprovoked. But Russia all along was saying, hey, Ukraine, we've put up with all this. Like, you lied to us and you expanded eastward. You took Poland, you took, all these countries, the Baltic states. You said you wouldn't do it, but we just accepted it. But Ukraine is not acceptable. And they made that crystal clear, and the Americans knew it. The Americans knew that this was a red line, and they rejected it. So there's never been any intention, nobody can point to, or the ability to actually to threaten Europe as a whole. Russia was always looking for just a buffer state, say, please stop before you get to Ukraine, and they wouldn't even promise to do that. So it's just a completely different situation. This is not, first of all, it's not a defensive alliance. It does engage in offensive operations, and that's why why Russia doesn't want it on its borders. It is a real threat to them. And if Ukraine had been brought into NATO, again, with the hotheads, the ultranationalists that are in Ukraine, they could very easily provoke, attack Russia and provoke a war, and then immediately all of NATO would be brought in. And so Russia said, we just can't have that kind of danger on our borders.
Right. Well, why is Russia okay with countries like Finland, for example, joining NATO, or we have Estonia, Latvia? These are all bordering Russia as
Yeah,
well.
well, they're not really okay with it. They're not happy about that. It does create problems for them. But Ukraine is a special case. I mean, first of all, Ukraine is historically the territory through which Western invaders have invaded Russia. That's the way the Napoleon came and the Nazis came, and so there's that. And then Ukraine is just so much larger. So that was just, it was, they're not happy with any of it. They weren't happy with Poland, they're not happy, or with Romania or anything, but it's just that Ukraine is the bridge too far. And that's what they made clear from the beginning.
Right. I mean, You say Russia doesn't have the capability to threaten Europe. Well, it does in the sense that it has nuclear weapons, right?
Oh yeah, well
So
of
I
course,
mean,
yeah, but no, of course, but it just can't.
but
It
I'm
doesn't have a conventional army, that could actually invade such a large territory and occupy it. I mean,
right.
it's
It's
going to be
clear.
a strain on its resources to even occupy, like half of Ukraine.
Right. Well, I think it's also just so important now, especially in the modern age where we have the internet, to win public opinion. I think that is really important, and it's very hard to have the same propaganda narrative machines that we had in the past. I mean, they can try. I mean, we still. I'm surprised actually how effective they still
They
are. As you
still
can
are
see
very
with the
effective. Yeah.
right, but not as effective as they used to be. People are breaking away slowly, and there are people that are in their ideological bubbles clearly. But I think if you are clearly an expansionist power that is just hell bent on taking territory and cleansing the land, it's very hard to win over that public opinion support. So I think that's one of the big constraining things, and I think that's a big mistake with Israel right now that it's doing that. It's just clearly just wanting to create this greater Israel and just wants to ethnically cleanse the land of Palestinians, and everybody can see it. And the more that it's trying to do it, even though it has a huge, conventional media behind it, it's running into the fact that hey, this is the 21st century. You can't just do this completely, but. The fact that that Russia does have all these nuclear weapons, is just more proof that you want to keep a buffer zone between you and Russia.
Right.
So while you don't want Finland, you don't want these countries on your border that are ideologically opposed to you or have the intention of dismantling you. You want that buffer zone. It's just going to be safer for everybody. Don't keep two nuclear armed powers just right next to each other that clearly have beef,
Right. Yeah. No. It's just as a practical question, right? It just makes buffer zones, neutral countries make a great deal of sense. Again, we used to be much more practical about this. Back when the Soviet Union, again, clearly was our ideological adversary. That they represented a different social system. I guess now, Russia does. It's a completely different set of ideologies, but today, but back then there was no question about it. They were our ideological adversary. They were our enemy, and but we were in favor. For example, I think Eisenhower was very happy when Austria chose neutrality. He thought it was actually good for the West. It would reduce tensions, if we had these neutral zones along the border.
So do you believe that NATO should just be disbanded completely, or that we should maybe retract NATO to, what it used to be originally?
I think it needs to be torn down. It's turned into this, just an instrument of globalism and of U.S. domination of Europe. I think the Europeans should understand that actually it's not Russia that's threatening them; it's the U.S. It's not Russia that blew up their pipeline; it was the U.S. It's not Russia that dictates to them, what they can do and what they can't do, and with horrible economic consequences. It's the U.S. and the U.S. dominates them, through NATO. In large part. So they should just get rid of NATO. The Europeans, if they had any sense, and there are dissident political parties that see this, but all the ruling parties in Europe are, with the exception, of course, of Hungary and Slovakia, don't see it. They prefer to be vassals.
Do Europeans want to get rid of NATO? I feel like
I'm sure some of them do. I don't know I haven't seen recent polls. I don't know what it is. I'm sure there's probably a fairly large fraction of the population that wants to see NATO go. I don't know what the percentage is.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big problem that the United States has in terms of preserving its hegemony and its control over Europe is that America is no longer cool and hip. If you think about America back in the day, let's say in the 90s or even earlier 80s, and when it was good to be associated with the United States. This was the country of blue jeans, McDonald's, Star Wars, rock and roll. I mean, we were objectively cool. And now I feel like that mask has kind of fallen off, and we don't look cool at all. We look evil, perverted, stupid, demented. Yeah, supporting genocide. It's just people don't want to be associated with us as much anymore. And I think that has a huge undermining effect on.
Yeah, I think in the long run it really does. I think there's no question about it.
Right, because now it's not so people don't want to be associated with the U.S. as much in Europe. It's easier to be like, America doesn't seem that cool. I think a lot of it actually really has to do with our support of Israel. I think that's probably been more damaging to us than anything.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's no question about it.
Well, so, okay, I think you explained pretty well why NATO doesn't really serve a purpose. It's not, the purpose is to keep Europe under the heel of the United States. The purpose is to preserve U.S.-led hegemony. So do you think that NATO can be disbanded or destroyed? I mean, Trump voiced those sentiments. Do you think there's a possibility?
No,
or
I don't see it happening, anytime soon. Name one bureaucracy that was dismantled. For example, in the U.S., I remember when Reagan came to power in 1980. One of the planks in the Republican platform was abolish the Department of Education, abolish the Department of Energy. They're still standing. It's just like these institutions, they never go anywhere. They only get bigger. And that seems to be the general law of bureaucracy. It just
eventually
expands.
They collapse under their own
you have to go finally to, it's just sort of like there are tumors on the host body, and the tumors just keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually they kill the host. I guess that's what happens. But
do you see that happening with NATO? I mean, obviously, if Russia is clearly defeating NATO in Ukraine. This is a war between Russia and NATO, and we're just using Ukrainian lives for this. And we've expended most of the Ukrainian lives, which is just horrific.
Yeah.
But once that's done, I mean, won't NATO have to have some? Isn't that going to shake up NATO? Isn't there going to be some kind of restructuring?
Yeah. It may very well. I know people say that, this is the end of NATO. I tend to think the opposite, that it'll just strengthen NATO, or at least its hold on what, on Europe. They'll ring the alarm bells and say, we were unprepared. We need to double in size. We need to triple our budgets. We need to hire 10,000 more people for our headquarters in Brussels or wherever. And I think that's more likely what's going to happen. I mean, the only way NATO is going to go is if some of these truly anti-globalist parties start winning elections in major countries like Germany and France, and that might, and they stay true to their principles, they could bring about the end of NATO. But I don't see it happening.
Well, I mean, you say that maybe they'll just want to double down and expand and pump more money into it. But you've also told me before that, how they talk about Russia being this existential threat and they're going to roll into Europe, but you don't see countries raising their defense budgets.
Yeah.
They're not making any. You just told me last Friday that, with Germany, that the reason the government fell apart, the coalition government fell apart, is because one of them said, we don't have the money to give more money to Ukraine to keep this going. So I just don't. I think the economics are coming to a head with NATO expansion as well, or NATO budget.
Well, no, it's true. There are constraints, and there's a question, like I've said all along, about how real this hysteria and panic. Just like in the U.S., we're talking about prior to the election of Donald Trump. All these people are saying, that democracy itself is at stake. He's a fascist, et cetera, et cetera. So you really believe that, and you probably should carry out a coup. And maybe there are some people who still really believe that, and they might attempt a coup. That could still happen. But I just noticed how quickly, like the New York Times, They were making those kind of statements right up until the day of the election. And after that, they immediately moderated their tone. It's like, okay, well, that act didn't really work out too well. Let's adopt a new pose. And I think that's true of most people. So, it's the same thing in Europe. There's all this anti-Russian hysteria, but they, as you pointed out, they have not been backing it up with real financial, commitments. Or, up to a point they have. Let's be honest. They've given them a lot of money, but there are obviously limits. If they really thought like the existence of Europe was at stake, they would be forking over much more, and they wouldn't be worrying about budget constraints and so on, just as you're saying. Now, if Russia achieves a major victory, still Russia is moving slowly. Clearly, they're winning this war, and they are pulverizing the Ukrainian army. And the southern Donbass, the Ukrainian front there is in a state of collapse. But it's still, like if you look at the larger map, it's just not quite obvious what's going on. But at some point, the Russians will break through completely, and they'll just start marching to the Dnieper, and then maybe they'll cross the Dnieper, and they'll start marching on Odessa. And we'll just see what happens at that point. Maybe the hysteria will become real. Maybe the panic will become real, and it might be backed up by some, something substantial, troops on the ground. That's what or major investments in NATO. It remains to be seen. It remains to be seen.